You're here at this exact moment, on July 23rd, and I need you to understand that it wasn't the algorithm that brought you here. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. There is a very specific quality in the last 3 days of whoever is watching this video right now, and I'm going to describe it with surgical precision so you can understand what is really happening inside you. In recent days, you have felt a silent restlessness that has no name. It is not sadness. It is not clinical anxiety. It is something different, a feeling that something is about to change and that you, deep down, already know it. You have thoughts that arise before sleep and are still there when you wake up. There is an unasked question circulating beneath everything you do, a feeling that you are on the edge of something but still can't see what is on the other side. There is a subtle tension between what your life is now and what something inside you insists it could be. This tension is not comfortable, it was not invited, but it is there, and you know that it is. If this does not accurately describe your current state, perhaps this video is not for you. But if it does, stay, because what I'm going to share in the next few minutes is not motivation, it is not decorative spirituality, it is a diagnostic map for what is happening in your consciousness now, and ignoring this process will cost a price you are not yet calculating. There is a phenomenon documented by philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual traditions from completely different cultures around the world that happens with a certain predictability at specific moments in human life. It is when consciousness begins to reorganize itself, when the level at which you operate begins to shift, when the version of you that existed until yesterday begins to become too small for the being that is emerging, and there are absolutely clear signs that indicate this process is occurring. Today I am going to show you 7 of them, but first, you need to understand what is happening on July 23rd, because the date is not random, and the fact that you are here on it has a meaning that goes far beyond what appears on the surface. July 23rd. For the ancient Egyptian traditions, this period marked the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when the brightest star in the night sky became visible again on the horizon after 70 days of total absence. For the Egyptians, this was not just an astronomical event recorded on papyrus. It was the most anticipated sign of the year, the sign that a new cycle was beginning, a renewal not of the calendar, but of collective consciousness. It was the moment when the Nile overflowed its banks with a new layer of fertile sediment, preparing the soil for a harvest completely different from the previous one. And in many other traditions, Mayan, Hindu, Celtic, indigenous peoples of the Americas, there is recognition that certain moments of the annual cycle create more favorable internal conditions for conscious transformation. Not because supernatural forces descend and operate on you without your participation, but because the alignment of external cycles with internal cycles creates a window where resistance to growth costs more energy than growth itself. I am not going to tell you that the universe will descend and save you. That would be cheap romanticism, and you deserve more than that. What I am going to tell you is this. There are moments in the cycle of any human being in which internal and external conditions align in a way that makes transformation exponentially more accessible. And if you know how to recognize these moments when they arrive, you stop wasting them by living the same day in infinite repetition. The problem is that most people won't recognize it, and not for lack of intelligence. Most will feel this energy and attribute it to stress, to accumulated fatigue, to a bad day. They'll wait for the feeling to pass, return to the same routines, the same thoughts, the same patterns, and wake up tomorrow exactly the same person they were yesterday. The window will close and they won't realize it ever existed. You are not the majority. You are here. That alone already tells you something about the internal infrastructure you have to process what is about to happen. So let's get into the 7 signs, and pay attention not only to what I will describe, but to the reaction of your own body as you listen. Because your system already knows, it is waiting for you to articulate what it is already living. The first sign is the most unsettling and the most misdiagnosed of all. Reality stops feeling the same. It's not depression. It's not clinical alienation. It's something more subtle and paradoxically deeper and more significant than any of these diagnoses. It's a sensation that people try to name in different ways and rarely find the right words. because the vocabulary available to describe genuine spiritual experiences is poor in most modern languages. Think of something that until very recently was a priority for you. A goal, an achievement you pursued with real energy, with genuine enthusiasm, with a clarity about why it mattered, a relationship that seemed central in your life, an environment that once filled you with meaning, a conversation that once stimulated you, a social role that once defined you with pride. Now imagine looking at that and feeling nothing. Not apathetic indifference. That would be easy to name and relatively easy to treat. But something stranger and harder to articulate. A neutrality that seems almost clinical. As if you were looking at someone else's life through a pane of glass. As if the goals you chose 2 years ago, that seemed so important, so urgent, so fundamental, were the plans of a version of yourself that you can barely recognize anymore when you search through your internal memory albums. This terrifies people when it happens, because the mental health systems trained to diagnose and treat diseases call it anhedonia, depression, burnout, dissociation. And in some cases, it might be exactly that, and it deserves clinical attention. But in many others, especially in people who have already traveled some distance within themselves, who have already developed some degree of self-knowledge, this specific state is the sign that the internal value system is being reorganized below the surface, without asking permission and without offering a prior roadmap. Imagine that you spent years building a house on a piece of land that you didn't fully choose consciously. The land was determined by your family, by your culture, by your fears, by the expectations you internalized, before you had enough awareness to question them. You decorated the walls with tastes that were approved. You arranged the furniture in the way that made sense for who you believed you were. You created routines that worked within those walls and that gave you a sense of identity and purpose. And suddenly the ground begins to move. It's not because the house is collapsing. It's because the land is expanding. And the house you built, those goals, those relationships, that sense of identity, that definition of success, needs to be rebuilt on larger foundations in a space that the previous version of you had no access to imagine. The discomfort is not a sign of collapse. It's a sign of expansion. And the difference between these two states, collapse and expansion, can be hard to perceive from within, especially when you are in the middle of the process. The person experiencing this sign for the first time usually panics and tries to force the enthusiasm back. They go after the same stimuli that used to work and get confused when those stimuli no longer produce the same effect. They try to convince themselves the problem is them, that they need to be more grateful, more focused, more positive, more dedicated. They add more goals, more commitments, more external structures in an attempt to artificially recreate the feeling their internal state is no longer generating spontaneously. And this attempt to force a return to the previous state is exactly what delays the transformation process and increases suffering. Because what is happening isn't a problem to be solved. It's an evolution to be endured. The first great wisdom an expanding consciousness must learn is this: don't try to resurrect what is being finalized. Learn to stand inside the void without needing to fill it immediately. The void is not the enemy. It's the space where the new is being generated, in silence, without announcements, without scheduled delivery dates. If you can recognize this state, if the words I'm using now describe something you are living, then I want you to do one thing right now. Write in the comments the word mudança. One word, no explanation. Just declare that you are recognizing this process in yourself. Because this simple declaration is not just a comment for the algorithm. It's an act of internal recognition. It's your conscious mind telling your nervous system, I see what is happening and I am not running away. And what you recognize, you begin to integrate in a different way from what you avoid. The second sign appears when you start noticing patterns where before you only saw noise, synchronicities, coincidences that seem too numerous to be statistically irrelevant, unexpected encounters with people at the exact moment you were thinking about them, numbers that repeat on the clock, on license plates, on receipts, a song that plays on the radio exactly when you're thinking about the lyrics' words, a book that falls off the shelf open to the exact page that answers the question you've been carrying for days. Now, I'm going to be honest with you about this in a way that very few people in this space are willing to be. because I respect your intelligence too much to offer you sugary spirituality without foundation. I am not claiming that the universe is sending coded messages through digital clock displays. I am not claiming that there is a supernatural agency rearranging external circumstances to create specific encounters that serve you. Those claims would be verifiable and likely incorrect. But I am claiming something equally powerful and far more verifiable. When your attention reorganizes itself, what you perceive in your environment changes radically. And when what you perceive changes, the reality you experience changes concretely, measurably, with real consequences in your life. The human brain processes an incomprehensible volume of sensory information per second. Conservative estimates suggest something around 11 million bits per second, and filters out nearly everything. 99.9% of available reality is discarded before it reaches consciousness. What passes through the filter is determined to a large extent by what the nervous system is searching for, consciously or unconsciously. It is the same mechanism that makes you buy a red car and suddenly see red cars everywhere. They were always there. You didn't see them because your attention system was not looking for them. When your consciousness is in transition, the filter shifts. Patterns, connections, parallels, signs that have always existed in the environment suddenly become visible. Not because they appeared out of nowhere, but because you finally have the eyes, the perceptual structure, the configuration of attention necessary to see them, and what you do with this phenomenon determines much about the direction of your development. Most people go to one of two equally useless extremes. Either they completely dismiss the experience with the narrative, "It's just coincidence. My mind is looking for patterns, it has no meaning at all," or they become obsessed with reading the signs to the detriment of action, waiting for the perfect alignment of synchronicities to validate a decision they already know they need to make. Neither extreme serves your growth. What serves is using these perceptions as what they truly are, invitations to reflection. When you notice a synchronicity, when the pattern repeats in a way that captures your attention, the correct question is not, "Is the universe sending me a message?" The correct question is, what inside me is so active, so magnetized, so in motion, that it has begun to reorganize what I am perceiving in the external world? Because synchronicity reveals the interior. It is a mirror of what is moving in layers that the conscious mind has not yet fully articulated. And if you learn to read that mirror, not as a crystal ball that predicts the future, but as an indicator of your own current internal state, you gain access to information about yourself that no rational analysis can provide with the same speed and depth. The pattern that repeats is often a sign that some part of you has already made a decision that your conscious mind is still debating. And mental debate has an expiration date. The longer you spend internally arguing about what some part of you already knows, the more energy you waste in a circular loop without advancing. Write in the comments, "Ready," if you are recognizing these signs in yourself. If you feel that your presence here today is not random. Ready, one word. It is enough. Because declared words, written, spoken aloud, consolidate internal states in a way that silent circular thinking simply cannot. The third sign is one of the ones that generates the most resistance because it directly contradicts everything we've been taught about loyalty, commitment, and personal identity. Detachment begins to happen spontaneously, without planning, sometimes without warning. I'm not talking about philosophical detachment, the kind you read about in Buddhist texts and find conceptually beautiful, but cannot truly apply because it seems too abstract to relate to your real life. I'm talking about something that happens in concrete life, gradually and sometimes surprisingly abruptly. You begin to drift away from people, habits, environments, and identities that were part of who you were, not by initial conscious decision, but as a natural result of having grown beyond what those connections could sustain. Friendships that once seemed essential, that you couldn't imagine not having, begin to feel empty of real substance. Conversations that once energized you begin to drain you in ways you struggle to justify rationally. Environments that were once comfortable and familiar begin to feel small, suffocating, limiting. Habits that defined your identity for years, ways of speaking, ways of spending time, ways of reacting to challenges, begin to feel incompatible with who you are becoming. And here is the central problem that creates so much unnecessary suffering. The culture in which we live, almost universally, pathologizes detachment. It teaches us that pulling away from people is selfishness or ingratitude, that changing is inconsistency or weakness of character, that abandoning old habits is a lack of discipline or commitment, that if you no longer fit into the same groups, the same conversations, the same environments, the problem is you, something is wrong with you, you need to adjust, and not that you have outgrown them. This narrative serves a comprehensible social function. Group cohesion depends on a certain stability among its members, but it keeps people trapped in outdated versions of themselves for decades. It keeps relationships that should have completed their cycle years ago. It keeps habits that sabotage growth in ways the person can no longer even see because they have become so normalized. It keeps identities that have expired but are still being worn because there is no, in the culture, a rite of passage that consciously replaces them. The detachment that emerges from a genuine process of growth is not loss in the sense of defeat. It is internal natural selection. It is the organism eliminating what no longer serves the level at which it now operates, with the same biological intelligence with which the body discards cells that have completed their function to make space for the cells that the next cycle requires. And exactly as in any biological process of renewal, trying to retain what the system has already decided to discard generates illness. It generates low-grade anxiety that never fully goes away. It generates depression that has no apparent cause but does not yield. It generates that persistent, disorienting sensation that you are living a life that is no longer yours, playing a character that no longer matches the being inhabiting your body. But there is a critical distinction I need to make here, because confusing it carries a high cost. And the confusion is extremely common. Not all discomfort in a relationship or situation is a sign that you have outgrown it. Sometimes the discomfort is a sign that you still have work to do there, that there is something this situation or relationship is showing you that still needs to be integrated. Sometimes the impulse to pull away is a sophisticated flight disguised as spiritual growth. It is the avoidance mechanism using the language of evolution to justify what is fundamentally a defensive retreat. The difference lies in the quality of the sensation beneath the narrative. The detachment that is born genuinely from growth has a calm clarity and a kind of mature sadness underneath the discomfort, a recognition that something of value has reached its natural end. The flight that masquerades as growth has an agitated anxiety and an urgent need for justification beneath the spiritual language. You know the difference. Your body knows it. You only need to be quiet enough to hear what the body is saying underneath the narration the mind is producing. What is leaving your life in this period is not necessarily what you imagine it is, and what is arriving is also not what you expect to arrive. Transformation is rarely linear, or poetic, or convenient. It is organic, sometimes messy. Sometimes it arrives mixed with something that looks like destruction before revealing its nature as construction. And almost always it requires you to endure the uncertainty of the interval between what has been completed and what is still being gestated. The fourth sign operates at a deeper layer than the previous three, because it does not manifest primarily in the relationship with the external world. It manifests in the relationship with your own perception of internal reality. The way you interpret problems begins to change in a fundamental way. I will be precise here because this sign is often mistaken for superficial optimism, New Age positive thinking, or simply the temporary effect of a good book or an intense spiritual retreat. It is none of the three. When consciousness genuinely and permanently changes level, what changes is not the content of your problems. The problems continue to exist. What changes is the frame of reference, the internal structure of observation from which you experience them. And this change in the frame of reference has extraordinarily concrete practical consequences for what you are able to do, create, and endure. A problem observed from a limited frame of reference appears as a wall, an insurmountable obstacle, an injustice of the universe, a definitive sign that you are not capable, you are not enough, you are not made for what you aspire to. The problem completely fills the internal visual field, blocks any perspective beyond itself, and generates an emotional state of contraction that further reduces the resources available to face it. The same problem, observed from an expanded frame of reference, presents itself in a completely different way. It appears as data, as information about what still needs to be developed, as a necessary compression that precedes an expansion, the way wood needs to bend before it can be shaped into something new. Not because the problem is less real or less painful, but because the perspective from which it is observed has more dimensions, more context, more available response possibilities. Think of a map. If you only have the map of a specific neighborhood, any problem that lies outside that neighborhood seems impossible to solve because you have no internal representation of where to go, of what resources exist beyond the visible limits of the map you have. If you have the map of an entire city, the same problems that once seemed impossible present themselves simply as the need to find the right path. The territory did not change, the map changed, and the map is your consciousness. When your consciousness expands, the internal map grows, and problems that once seemed impossible begin to appear as solvable, not because they have become objectively easier, but because now you have an internal representation of a larger territory, of more resources, of more possibilities. This also transforms the relationship with fear in a way that many people describe as the most liberating change they have ever experienced. A consciousness that has not expanded lives with fear as an absolute enemy, as an unequivocal sign that something must be avoided, that real danger exists, that the safe move is to retreat. Fear paralyzes because the automatic narration that accompanies it is, if you advance in that direction, something will go very wrong. Then expanding consciousness begins to develop a different relationship with fear. Not a relationship of absence of fear, that would be psychopathy, not growth, but a relationship where fear begins to be perceived as a pointer, as location information precisely about where growth is still needed, where the frontier has not yet been crossed, where development still has work to do. Fear does not disappear, but it progressively loses its ability to paralyze because the interpretation changes. And when the interpretation changes, the behavioral response changes automatically without requiring heroic willpower each time. This is what the fifth sign reveals. The source of your internal state begins to shift gradually from the external to the internal. You progressively stop needing circumstances to align in a certain way in order to access states of peace, clarity, or determination. This is not Buddhist passivity or Stoic resignation. It is the beginning of true autonomy, of what the Greek philosophers called autarkia, the capacity to be governed from within rather than completely determined by what comes from without. For most of life, the majority of us operate in a state of emotional dependence on external circumstances that we rarely recognize as dependence, because everyone around us operates the same way, and normality is hard to question when it is universal. We need validation from other people to feel enough. We need things to go according to plan to feel secure. We need certainty before we act. We need results to stay motivated. We need the weather to be good, others to be in a good mood, the news to be reasonable, the environment to be tranquil. This mode of operating is not moral weakness or a character flaw. It is the default mode of operation of a nervous system that never received different training, that runs on programs installed in childhood when there was no ability to choose which programs to install. But it is a mode that creates absolute vulnerability to the external environment. Any variation in the outside world immediately produces a corresponding variation in the inside world. Your internal stability becomes entirely contingent on the stability of factors completely outside your control. When consciousness shifts level, this gradually begins to reverse. Not magically, not instantaneously, not permanently one after a single experience, but slowly, sometimes imperceptibly from day to day, built through repeated choices in specific situations. Yet it is real and verifiable in retrospect. You begin to notice that you can access states of peace, clarity, or determination regardless of what is happening around you. Not always, not perfectly, not without effort in the early stages, but with increasing frequency that was previously completely inaccessible. You begin to be able to choose your response to the environment instead of being automatically determined by it. You begin to find, between the stimulus and the response, a space where choice is possible. That space, that capacity for pause between what happens and what you do, is the most precise marker of a consciousness that has genuinely expanded. The sixth sign is where most people stall, not because they don't understand the concept, not because they lack the ability, but because it demands what is rarest in any development process: sustained consistency, without glamour, without an audience, without immediate validation. The decisions that consolidate change. There is a very seductive fantasy that runs deep through the personal development market and the contemporary spiritual space. The fantasy that transformation is an event, a sudden insight, an ecstatic experience or moment of clarity that permanently resets you. A forest retreat, a deeper meditation than all previous ones, a revelation that changes everything instantly and permanently. The search for this experience of instantaneous and definitive transformation fuels a huge industry and keeps many people in perpetual motion between one experience and another, without ever durably changing. This fantasy is as seductive as it is dangerous, because it places the power of transformation in something external, in an experience you need to attain, in a special environment, in an enlightened person who will transmit something you don't have, and removes responsibility from where it truly resides, in the decisions you make every day, in the absence of cameras and audience and validation, when no one is watching and when the feeling of inspiration has completely gone away, and all that remains is just the work. Real transformation operates in two layers that function at entirely different rhythms and that require entirely different things to sustain themselves. The first layer is the insight, the sudden understanding that reorganizes the way you see something, that opens a perspective that was previously inaccessible, that reveals a connection that was once invisible. These moments are real. They are important. They are the beginning of something. They are the map. But they have a very short biological shelf life. The nervous system that generated the insight returns to its baseline state within hours, sometimes within minutes, because the brain is an energy-saving organ and the insight state is metabolically expensive. If nothing changes in the behavioral layer after the insight, it becomes a beautiful memory, eventually distant, with no practical consequence whatsoever in real life. The second layer is behavior, the repeated decisions, the constructed habits, the structures created in daily life to honor what the insight revealed. This is the layer where transformation becomes embodied, where it leaves the mind and enters the body, your relationships, the choices of how you spend your time in the reactions that gradually become different from previous reactions. It is the layer of verifiable consequences in the real world. And here is the cruel trick that most people don't realize until they've spent years going in circles. Behavior does not automatically follow insight. There is no automatic mechanism that takes the new understanding and translates it into new action without active intervention on your part. It must be chosen repeatedly, especially in the moments when inspiration has completely gone. When the old version of you pulls in the familiar direction with all the force of habit, when the easiest, most automatic path is what you've always done before. Every decision you make in alignment with who you are becoming, even if small, even if imperceptible to others, even if no one knows you made it, is a vote. It is a declaration to your own nervous system that the new version is real, is permanent, is who you are. And the nervous system learns not through intellectual persuasion, not through conceptual understanding, not through emotional motivation, but through sustained behavioral repetition over time. New habits are not productivity luxuries or performance optimization techniques. They are architecture. They are the physical and neurological structure through which an expanded consciousness finds concrete form in the real world. Without this architecture, the expansion of consciousness remains floating and fragile, a power without expression, an understanding without consequence, a potential that never realizes itself because it was never embodied in the specific choices of everyday life. And coherence, between what you think, what you say, and what you do, is the fuel that keeps the process alive and moving. Whenever there is chronic incoherence among these three levels, the system goes into internal conflict and wastes there most of the energy that should be going toward real growth. Incoherence is not just morally uncomfortable, it is metabolically expensive. It is what creates the background fatigue that doesn't go away with sleep. Because it's not physical fatigue, it's the fatigue of existing in contradiction with yourself. The seventh and most fundamental sign is not something you will find outside yourself. It is a series of questions you must have enough courage to ask yourself, and enough honesty to hear the answers that emerge before your defensive mind intercepts them and replaces them with more comfortable versions. How do you know if you are truly leveling up? The first question: could the version of you from 6 months ago have predicted the kind of problems you are facing today? If the problems you face now are essentially the same as 6 months ago, even if with different names, characters, or contexts, you have not changed levels. You are on the same floor with different furniture and new wallpaper. If today's problems are substantively different from those of 6 months ago, if they demand from you a sophistication, a capacity to bear complexity, a way of making decisions that your previous version simply did not have, then you are genuinely moving. More sophisticated problems are indicators of growth. They are not punishment. They are the sign that you have the capacity to operate at a higher level. The second question: what do you accept in yourself today that was unacceptable to the version of you 1 year ago? And its direct opposite: what do you absolutely no longer accept in yourself today that you previously tolerated without question because it seemed normal or inevitable? Expanding consciousness has progressively higher internal criteria, not as neurotic perfectionism that never allows satisfaction, but as a standard of alignment with who you are becoming. What was once acceptable begins to seem incompatible with the integrity you are developing. The third question: are you asking questions you did not have access to formulate before? Because the quality of the questions a person can generate is an extremely precise indicator of the level of consciousness at which they operate. A mind that has not expanded asks the same questions in a loop, variations of the same central question it cannot yet reframe from a different angle. An expanding mind formulates questions it itself cannot yet fully answer, questions that open up territories instead of confirming already known territories. And it can bear the productive tension of not knowing, of remaining in the question without needing to collapse it into a premature answer that brings comfort but not truth. The fourth and perhaps most honest question of all: are you willing to be different from the people around you when that is necessary? Because genuine change in level of consciousness almost always creates a period of isolation. Not necessarily physical isolation, but isolation of perspective. The people who knew the previous version of you may not easily recognize the version that is emerging. They may resist it, question it, comfortably frame your changes as a phase, a crisis, a loss of yourself. And there is a deeply human and understandable temptation to retreat to what is familiar, to perform the previous version, to shrink back to the size everyone expects, so as not to lose belonging. The person who chronically yields to this temptation stops growing, not because they failed morally, but because the price of belonging in that particular group became constant shrinking, and no identity that requires you to shrink to maintain it serves your growth. Real growth always produces some form of separation before it produces a new kind of connection, with people who operate at the level you are becoming, with whom conversation has a kind of substance and depth that previous conversations no longer had. There are people around you right now at this very moment who are going through the same process, who feel the same identity displacement, who are reformulating the same fundamental questions about what is real and what is constructed, what matters and what is a habit of mattering, who are enduring the same productive void between what has been completed and what is still arriving. And when genuinely expanding consciousnesses meet, especially during transitional moments like the one we are living through, a mutual acceleration occurs, one that has no precise name in Portuguese, as if each served as a mirror for the other, revealing angles of growth that are virtually impossible to perceive entirely on your own. If you recognized yourself in any of the 7 signs I explored here today, if reality is losing its familiar flavor from before, if synchronicities are multiplying around you, if detachment is happening without you planning it, if your perception of problems and fears is shifting, if the source of your internal state is moving inward, if your decisions are beginning to differ from the ones you always made, if your questions are evolving into territories you previously had no access to, then you are not in crisis. You are in transition, and there is a fundamental difference between these two states, one that everyday language often collapses into a single word. A crisis is an unplanned interruption of a process that was working. A transition is the process working exactly as it was designed, towards something larger, more integrated, more aligned with the being you came to become. The growth of consciousness does not happen overnight. It is not an event, not a ceremony, not a date on the calendar that by itself makes the transformation happen for you. It is a path, continuous, sometimes winding, often lonely at certain stages, rarely linear, never entirely safe, but with a direction. And when you begin to recognize the signs of the path, when you stop interpreting synchronicities as coincidence, detachment as loss, emptiness as emptiness, and start reading each of these states for what they truly are, you stop resisting the process and begin collaborating with it, actively, intentionally, and maturely. And that intentional collaboration, that moment when you shift from someone to whom transformation is happening to someone who is consciously choosing to go through it, is the most fundamental change any human being can make. You spent the last few minutes hearing about 7 signs that your consciousness is changing levels, but hearing is only the first movement. The second movement, the one that determines whether this remains a temporary intellectual experience or becomes something real and permanent in your life, is what you decide to do now in this moment, with what you recognized in yourself. The question is not whether you are capable of change. The question is whether you are willing to honor the process that has already begun, with the decisions, the habits, the coherence, and the courage that real transformation demands, day after day, especially on the days when inspiration does not show up. What you heard today was the preparation. It was the diagnosis. It was the map of the 7 signs. The next step, what this means in practice for your decisions, for building the version of yourself that is already emerging, for the concrete actions that translate this awareness into physical reality, is in the next video that will appear on your screen now. Click on it. The first 60 seconds will reorganize the way you are thinking about everything we discussed today. If this video touched something real and true in you, subscribe to this channel. Not because subscriber count is a vanity metric I need, but because what you found here today is not an isolated video. It is a coordinate within a larger map. Every video in this sequence is a layer that deepens what the previous one established, and losing the sequence means losing the context. It means being left with pieces of a map that only makes sense as a whole. The window does not last forever, but you have already crossed the first threshold, recognition. And recognition, when it is honest, when it is real, when it is not merely intellectual but visceral, is already the beginning of something that can no longer be undone. The next step is yours.